Walking through the rooms of the Berlinische Gallery, the planned route's chronological order introduces us to different stages of stylistic and ideological decisions to which artists in Berlin have historically resorted to making sense out of the world they had to live in, facing, rejecting, denouncing, grieving, analyzing the significant events that plagued the long 20th century. Starting from the embracing of modernism in the early 1900s to Dada radical rule breaking to showcase the absurd of World War I, to expressionist ideas about the perpetually tense state of the world, to the constructivist need for rationality and precision, the gallery does a great job at contextualizing what we see, facilitating connection with artists' logic and emotion. We finally make it to the building's deepest room, dedicated to Berlin in the shadow of its wall, which came to divide the Western and Soviet blocs from 1961 until 1989. The description warns us about young artists existentially questioning their role in society. They critiqued previous generations' decision to use abstraction as a tool to deal with the havoc of war, arguing that it had created a divide between life and art that shouldn't exist. They grew ever more aggressive and anti-bourgeoisie, influenced by the rock and punk movements in the city, and turned to techniques that would catch the general public's eye. We turn right, and we are united with an odd and alarming kind of creature. It rises in it 160 centimeters of height, demanding that we look up to take in its fullness. Contrasting with the pure and sterile white light falling on its surroundings, the dismal and lugubrious atmosphere of the object's existence is too heavy to be overlooked, so we look over. The scrutiny process begins. Thick and brute, however incredibly accurate, its strokes describe a human figure. Presumably, this robust, wide-shouldered and collapsed shape is a man. The composition of the painting outlines a triangle that guides us from each bottom corner all the way up to the tip. There we find the face of the subject whose misshapen body stands, scared, scarred, over us. We observe its clothes, bulky and oversized, like a soldier's uniform. Thinking about the context provided by the museum, we wonder if this painting is a depiction of the author's perception of those who fought in war. Remembering that the room's description talked about young artists reclaiming representational styles to highlight political torpor, perhaps it is an attempt to point out the rapid disconnect between the massacres of World War II and Berlin's recently walled society. But who is this person? We go to the label next to the canvas looking for answers. Georg Baselitz, its author, gave this piece to the world in 1966 and hid in its name a clue that makes us revise our interpretation: a modern painter. We scrutinize again, now having incorporated the partially autobiographical tint of the painting. In the journey from his feet to his eyes, we encounter all sorts of evidence of misfortune. His hands, consumed by an object that seems to give whatever gets into them an intermittent cut, progressively disappear and bleed over his feet. His pants are dirty and torn right between his legs to reveal a spring that takes the place of his genitals. It is an odd decision to show the penis of a clothed figure, isn't it? Painted with a faded stroke the color of his skin, the spiral loses intensity the further it gets from the rest of his body. Is this a castrated painter? Do we see an intentional symbol of the subject's vulnerability? A similar type of stroke is appreciated in the line with a twirly tip on his right side, resembling a pig's tail. On the opposite side of his body, his arm has been flayed and shows his raw red skin, with pieces of the upper layers still hanging open. The other red element standing out is not blood, but what seems to be a red bag on his back, carrying 3 paint brushes. Remember how we thought his clothes were a soldier's uniform? By establishing a pictorial connection between the suffering of war and the status of the art maker, Baselitz, a modern painter, is a reconsideration of the artist's role in a rotten society, presumably the hopeless feelings he obtains from being a modern artist living in a post-war divided Berlin. Under his framing, his shredded hands take on a new meaning. Knowing that these are the primary tool of an artist's endeavor, having them be captured, pressed, bleeding, indicates his ultimate resignation. The artist, unarmed, faces submission. What is the point of creating art if it is separated from the world? He's hurt, bruised, all the weight of the world's pain falling on his shoulder, making him collapse. The dark atmosphere created by the empty background and the suffering denounced over it seems to change the logic and meaning of its colors. Yellow, red, blue are all mute, covered by a tint of grief. It is now time to move on to his face. With the same coarse and thick style, The expression of this modern painter does not need any more details to show the despair and confusion in his eyes, a lack of meaning that does not even bother to look into the world for answers. Looking up, he deprives us forever of his stare, both allowing us to examine his distress without observing the rules of prudence, and revoking any sort of connection or confrontation, resolution. By zooming into his head, the decentralization of his figure creates a frame of surrendered factions against the void. Physically and metaphorically grounded on this world through his pain, the artist directs his begging stare out into something beyond this reality, looking for the answers that his creative endeavor no longer satisfies. When will it ever stop? How can art do something about it? Is there a purpose for existing? Perhaps God listens.